right, good afternoon everyone. Good to see you all here. And welcome to our Friday seminar. And it is my pleasure to introduce today very briefly Professor Ann O'Donnell of New York University. And I think it's your first visit here, Ann?
It is, yes. Well, in this capacity.
In this capacity. And she's a graduate of Princeton University, PhD from Princeton University, and before she joined the faculty in NYU, and the author of the book that you could see on the screen, Power and Possession in the Russian Revolution. And all I can say is this simply a fantastic tour de force. We talk a lot about the building of socialism, about collectivization, the major campaigns, etc. But very rarely, if any, we have studies that tells us how it really worked on the ground with individuals. What did it mean to socialize property, to take a country with a huge population with private property and in 5 years bring them to socialism. And this is an amazing story of ideology, fanaticism, policies, and corruption and opportunism that sometimes you read the book and you cannot stop smiling, but then you also remind yourself how tragic was it all together. And we have here Professor O'Donnell to lead us through the first 5 years of this mayhem called Socialism in the Soviet Union, 1917 to 2022. You're welcome.
Especially for the invitation. I really appreciate it. It's a delight to be back here after so long. I had the privilege of studying here with a young Bob CREEES. Several decades ago, I took one class, and I am just really thrilled to be speaking to you all today about my book. I want to thank also Mary Grace and Giovanna, although I think they're not here, for all of their help. Oh, yeah, there they are, yes. Mary Grace is at least for all of her help in arranging my visit, which has been a real pleasure. So I typically start with, as one does with an anecdote. I'm going to try and condense it a little bit because I do have a tendency to run on with it, but it is a bit long, so bear with me. I promise there's a methodological payoff at the end, I hope. It starts in early November 1917, in fact, just a few days after the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd, when a widow by the last name of Tikhobrasova was at home in her apartment packing up all of her things. She was packing up her apartment because she was leaving for a city in the Caucasus called Armavir, where her grown son had been assigned to a military posting as a railway engineer. Over the next several days, she made every effort to, once she had her possessions packed, to ship them by rail to the city in the hopes of making it her new home. But given the chaos of the moment, she was unsuccessful, and she eventually had to settle for storing all of her stuff, like you do, I'm sure, every summer when you are going to and from campus to retrieve at a future date. Soon after, she boarded a train for Armavir, and she would not return to Petrograd again for 3 years, as civil war raged and as rail connections between the two cities were completely severed. Tikhobrasova was hardly alone in her movements across the territory of the former Russian Empire, what was known at the time as the Soviet Republic, in the 3 years of civil war and revolution that followed the Bolshevik seizure of power. Nor was she alone in her decision toward the end of 1920, as the dust settled and as the outlines of Bolshevik power solidified, to make her way home. And so on New Year's Eve, 1920, she arrived back in Petrograd, and she went immediately to the warehouse where she had stored her household. And if she was very familiar in terms of the movement that she experienced and undertook in those 3 years, this was the moment when her story began to separate out from those of most of the other people we might encounter from this time, because where most people, upon their return to their home, found the movable trappings of their previous lives scattered or lost, Tikhobrasova found hers right where she left it. Right in the warehouse, she could even see it, she glimpsed it, she says, when she returned that day, New Year's Eve day, seemingly untouched. And the fact that her things were still there shocked not just her, but also the warehouse workers. who, when she tried to claim her things, didn't know what to do. And so appealed immediately up the chain of command. First, the clerks at the warehouse, appealing to the warehouse director, who stopped the release of her goods, give this woman back her things, her tables, her chairs, her silver. They go to their boss, who says, well, obviously I'll have to talk to my boss. And so the case is passed up to a man identified in the records only as Comrade Kimber. Comrade Kimber chaired an ad hoc body that had been created by the Petrograd Soviet in October 1920, just a few months before she got back, known as the Troika for requisitions and confiscations. Now, this body did not perform the seizures of things, which had swept across the territory of the former Russian Empire with great speed. Rather, the Troika existed as a kind of tribunal meant to resolve the huge numbers of conflicts that had grown out of the seizure of things over the previous 3 years. And so Comrade Kimber, head of Petrograd's Troika, immediately refused Tika Brazova's request to reclaim her possessions in the broadest possible terms. He denied her not only the right to recover her own goods, but also to receive household goods of any kind from the city's stock of seized things, even those making up the so-called material norm to which Petrograd residents were supposedly entitled. Tika Brazova, uncowed, took up life as a professional supplicant. She went back and forth. She went to see someone named Trelicer, who was the chair of the Petrograd Soviet at the time, the most significant administrative body in the city. She succeeded in gaining his permission to reclaim the norm of goods allocated per citizen from among her own stuff. She went back to the warehouse. They said no. She went to the People's Court. She filed a case against Kimber in the People's Court. She won. She went back to the warehouse. Kimber said no. The warehouse director backed him up. So she goes on and on and on, like someone who hasn't been through the revolution for the last 3 years, right? And so she shows up, she shows up, she shows up. Kimber has to keep dragging himself to these places, to keep saying no to her, left and right. And finally, it seems that he tires of this whole endeavor. And so he scrawls on the back of a piece of paper. It was actually, I think, like a taxi card, something. He writes on the back of a piece of paper, scrawls to an assistant, and I quote here, "Let's let her have the full norm of goods for 2. That is, including a samovar. It is time to be done with this matter once and for all." So at this point, the two sides have agreed on what would seem to be the most important question, how much she should get. And a decision is released for Tika Brazova that she may come to the city warehouse of seized things. She may take the norm for herself and then also for her son, the norm for 2. And instead of softening her or disposing her to go along with what he is proposing, this show of softness on Kimber's part seems to have energized Tika Brazova. So she dug in even further in her fight and insisted on getting not just any dining table, but her dining table. Not just any set of chairs, but her chairs, in the quantity allowed by the city's full norm. So she launches a whole new campaign, at which point the Troika declares that what are the chances her things have been lost? They're gone. She'll have to accept the city's norm of goods because now her things are in the wind. They have been finally inventoried, removed from the warehouse where she had left them, and lumped together with what is being called, quote, ownerless property across the city. Tika Brazova made one last stab, one last stand at getting her things. She showed up to the warehouse one morning in March with someone called a court implementer, because the People's Court institutions not being able to fully, avail themselves of the authority their names would seem to indicate, they needed people that they called implementers to go about and make sure other institutions listen to them. So the court implementer goes with her to the warehouse, and she tries to get her stuff back. At the warehouse gate, she presents her order, entitling her to select from her own possessions a quantity matching the norm for a 2-person household. The warehouse director appeared, and he began immediately, according to multiple accounts, to shout at her, quote, "Get out of here. It is not yours. It is all the people's." The court official wrote a description of the encounter, which was all he was entitled to do, and he left. But Tikhobrasova stayed. She lingered by the warehouse gates, and she poked her head this way and that, because she'd been back 3 months earlier. She had seen her things. She poked her head, straining to get a look at the spot where her things had been, and lo, just then, she spotted one of her own boxes right where she had left it, still intact and untouched. And at this, she began to cry. And a young woman working inside the warehouse approached her, asking, quote, "Why are you crying so bitterly?" And Tikhobrasova answered, "I have been left destitute. They have taken everything. Even the remembrances of my relatives are gone, even my album." The girl asked her what her album looked like and went away. And a few minutes later, she returned, bearing Tikhobrasova's album of photographs with a permission slip allowing her to take it home. Finn. So on October 17th, Bolshevik revolutionaries seized power in Petrograd and set to work fomenting what they hoped would become a global revolution, the destruction of capitalism and the dawn of a communist era in human history. In the days and months after seizing power, they declared themselves and the dissolving state they inherited to be masters of a dazzling array of resources. Nationalization decrees asserted ownership over major industries, transport infrastructure, banking networks, deepening confiscatory processes that had been initiated under the Tsarist government during the First World War. Local governments, meanwhile, claimed the rights to dispose of everything left in the wake of this other process, from bakeries to apartments to hats and coats. And in the blink of an eye, it seemed, the revolutionaries asserted themselves as the rulers not only of the land and the people, but also of material things, becoming purveyors-in-chief of Russia's material wealth. My book, Power and Possession in the Russian Revolution, is a history of this unprecedented quest to abolish private property and the search for an alternative system of political economy, socialism, that grew out of it. It's a history of possession without property and value without markets, of a search for new and transcendent methods for performing some of the most basic functions in any society, assigning things, holding them, exchanging them, and of the practices, strategies, and perils that shaped daily life in cities after the revolution, especially in Russia's two capital cities, Petrograd, the former empire's purpose-built capital, a grand edifice of palaces and office buildings, which the Bolsheviks abandoned in March 1918 in order to move to Moscow, Russia's merchant heart, with its warrens of ancient alleys and churches, and where the Bolsheviks would remain, and from which they would govern for the next 80 years. My book sprang to life from an unusual set of sources, originating in complaints just like Tikhobrasova's, sent by ordinary people to every level of government about the revolution writ large, its policies, its agents, their own life experience, all of which were rigorously investigated by revolutionary authorities through interrogation records, interviews, internal reports prepared by the secret police, audits of the police by other institutions, high-quality legal and political analysis performed by analysts left over from the old regime, all bound into these massive sort of dossiers like Tikhobrasova's was, where you get this sort of 360-degree vision, multiple institutions coming upon a particular nugget, a problem that the revolution had thrown up. The cases, or rather the stories that became cases were very interesting, in part because the way they grew into cases was because they posed some problem that, or a question to which revolutionary authorities had no answer, either because they reflected situations that existing Bolshevik ideology or governing practice or common mores had not yet encountered, or because they could be answered according to these same guiding frameworks in multiple ways, requiring them, in turn, to appeal upwards to greater and greater authorities. And so two things stood out to me about these files. First, their very existence underscored a sort of paradox about the revolutionary state, which was that it was total chaos all the time. People weren't listening to each other. The center and the peripheries were often not in contact, and yet they were somehow moving in sort of synchronous processes. Everything around the institutions and officers who composed these reports was chaos, and yet these reports also existed. This was therefore a state able to rigorously and continuously catalog its many failings, to show in minute detail just how much of a mess it was. Second, in terms of content, these files were overwhelmingly about property. Even the cases that weren't about property were about property. They might be about arrest, they might be about desertion or murder. Property was woven through these stories. The problem of property and its sudden absence from social life. The word property disappeared. So at first it was kind of hard for me to identify these stories as being about property because no one was using that term. They were using this massive alternative language, a lexicon of dispossession, of requisition, confiscation. Let's see, I wrote them all down here. Nationalization, municipalization, neighborhoodization, socialization, alienation, sequestration, theft. So these stories are not about property exactly, but about what happens when it seems there isn't any. The Bolsheviks, that is, thought of the elimination of property as a solution, as an endpoint in their journey towards socialism. But these sources immediately made clear that the abolition of private property was in fact the beginning of some other thing and an entry point into a new way of organizing people and things with its own set of problems. So just a few quick examples of some of these problems to give a sense of their sweep. Imagine, if you will, a cabinet standing in an apartment and you have just moved into that apartment. You are so fortunate as to have acquired some living space, as it was known in the revolutionary city, and here you are, you're in your room and there's this cabinet. And it's standing there and it's sealed, and you can see through maybe the glass panes, and it's got dishes in it, and also you have 4 small children. That's a lot, but maybe you have 2 small children. And there's a lot of ruckus sort of going on, and you are terrified about what is going to happen to this cabinet, and whether you will be held legally responsible for this object, this piece of furniture, that you've been saddled with, living in fear of arrest, that it might be broken. So the abolition of property presents a problem of holding things, of having things you don't want, that you somehow can't get rid of, no less than it does of losing things. Or take a report prepared by a woman named Natalia Sidova, who was the wife of Lev Trotsky, and who was also herself an official in the museums department of the Commissariat of Enlightenment, and who was writing to her colleagues, Anatoly Lunacharsky included, to argue against selling off Russia's artistic treasures abroad to foreign buyers, which is occurring at great speed. She observes that one of the reasons it's occurring at such great speed is because there is enormous confidence among officials in the Commissariat of Enlightenment that once world revolution comes, it will be very easy to get all of these things back. And so we can take the money now and run, and we'll get the stuff back later once the political process has unfurled. She has a note of caution for those who are thinking this way. Look, she says, at the relations among our country's new cities, at how they are fighting amongst each other over cultural treasures. Back and forth, back and forth. The dissolution of private ownership, she notes, of these masterpieces has not removed conflict over their disposal as we had all anticipated. It has instead, she writes, somehow heightened conflict. So through this trove of documents, these cases, my book marries the lived experience of the revolution with an inquiry into problems of political economy and state-making that are more commonly narrated through theoretical tracts and political statements and decrees and speeches. In method, it draws from the anthropology of late socialism and the social science of the Soviet collapse, as well as histories of law and economics outside the Soviet sphere in order to make 3 main arguments. The first has to do with seizure and state-making. The wave of revolutionary dispossession was massive. In Moscow alone, it saw several 100,000 people evicted, moved, or concentrated each year in which it took place from 1918 to 1920. Many more than this lost movable property, even if they were not physically displaced. My research makes clear that this episode, which was pivotal to the revolution and the development of socialism, that this episode was a surprise. It was an outgrowth of a wartime crisis of space that combined with the broad search for a socialist way of life and a quest for social justice. It was not decreed by the Bolsheviks in many places. Even so, it was deeply ideological, spread by a process of isomorphism, as places sought to replicate what they saw going on elsewhere in order to keep up, as well as rumor, lawlessness, and what was at the time sometimes called crime. So while these behaviors were often called lawless because there was no Bolshevik decree on them, it was characterized more accurately by a surfeit of law, by huge numbers of decrees attempting to govern new ways of holding things, local orders modeled on one another, and laying out many different and sometimes conflicting paths toward redistribution. The second argument regards the condition that resulted from this process, which I call propertylessness. My argument here is twofold. I describe this condition of propertylessness as a sort of musical chairs, as everyone from state officials and institutions to individuals activated formal and informal claims to things and spaces, creating a kind of churn, this sort of musical chairs that I mentioned that proved very difficult to stop once it was in motion. I argue that the Bolsheviks found this condition of propertylessness, in fact, intolerable and unsustainable, and sought to reverse it already in 1919, almost 2 years before the unveiling of the new economic policy, more commonly seen as the abandonment of what was later known as war communism. Second, I show that undergirding the change in economic policy was, in fact, a real stability in the methods of parsing economic life, in the methods of parsing and valuing and appraising things. And I use this section of my analysis to stake out a way of thinking about Soviet socialism as a set of methods for holding, counting, and valuing things and people. Identifying practices that endured after the revolutionary era and indeed held for, I think, the duration of the Soviet experience, even as policies governing economic life obviously changed. I show in particular how Bolshevik proclivities and political culture for secrecy, for instance, a tendency towards secrecy, shaped the operation of what the Soviets and the rest of the world, as a result, called socialism, but also how the mechanics of the immediate post-war moment intervened in Bolshevik ideology and shaped the project of political dominion that was the planned economy. Finally, third, I deal with the problem of closing the revolution and suppressing seizure. In April 1920, in an effort to regulate dispossession and to restrict it, the Sovnarkom, the executive of the Council of People's Commissars, published its first decree on the process of seizure, full stop. The decree on requisition and confiscation in April 1920 is when this decree appears. It, for the first time, gave a legal footing to this practice, terms on which it could and could not occur. Rather than slowing this churn, rather than stopping the musical chairs, this decree instead exacerbated and amplified conflict over things, unleashing furor over wrongful dispossession that had occurred in the previous 3 years. It saw people showing up at their old apartments, trying to get their stuff. It saw people hiring locksmiths to change locks on rooms, to lock out new neighbors, to get themselves access to things, as well as localities and institutions, namely the secret police, refusing to allow themselves to be governed by the new order because the institutions themselves had become accustomed to conducting all of their acquisition through seizure rather than other forms of exchange. Seizure had become the default mechanism for acquisition in official life, no less than in the lives of individuals. And so this forced the regime to embark upon a legal process of closing revolutionary dispossession that was core to the revolution itself, without at the same time invalidating the basic premise. Undoing dispossession without legitimating private property. So following this legal saga, which emerged in large part through Tika Brazova's case, the book finds that ultimately the only way the Bolsheviks discovered or found to end dispossession was to insist that it be forgotten, to consign all events occurring before a specific date, April 16th, 1920, to a kind of black box on which there would be no future discussion, no future cases, no recovery or return. So having thus far presented my book to you, I hope as something approaching a solid edifice of sources and arguments. I'm not going to try and take it apart and to destabilize what I've laid out for you as arguments that make sense in an effort to show how hard it was for me to see this story of dispossession as my book's central topic, not just because of the blinkered vision of a no longer particularly young, but maybe when I started young practitioner, but also because of features of the phenomenon itself that screened it from view. And as is common, I start here with revolutionary historiography. The revolution was not an obvious historiographical space for a junior scholar to pursue. Why is that? Largely because the people who wrote about the revolution for a generation declared it to be dead. And that might sound controversial had they not been willing to do so in print. Both in the United States and also in Russia, some of the literature's best known protagonists openly declared writing about and the problem of the revolution to be consigned to the dustbin of history, as it were. They did so, Sheila Fitzpatrick and Boris Kalinitsky, both of whom I admire a great deal, in 2014 and 2017, respectively. To state the obvious, the literature was not dead because all the questions had been answered, but rather because the polarization that had charged the existing literature had dissipated. History had ended. It was not clear what would come next or how to tell the story without the polarizing global significance that it had enjoyed. In the aftermath of the polarization, there was a turn in writing about the revolution to a stance of de-emphasis or de-signification. And so we saw the emergence of narratives of a continuum of war and revolution, for instance. That's Peter Holquist's brilliant book, as a stage of punctuated state collapse, as several scholars have written, or most recently, William Rosenberg as an emotional state of anxiety and fear and loss. And different as these approaches all are, what they share is a de-emphasis on the significance of Bolshevik ideology, the anti-capitalism part, either by broadening the lens to see how purportedly distinctive features of the Bolsheviks were in fact shared across ideological opponents, or to shift the focus onto things that might seem to escape ideological categories, like emotions or state integrity. So I didn't expect to embark on a study of the revolution itself first. On its very core, the anti-capitalism, the abolition of private property and markets, with the field moving in what had seemed like the opposite direction. I also did not recognize that that was the story I was seeing or the story I was telling, because it seemed to me that it was a story that I and everyone already knew. It's one that was very familiar to me, in part for the reasons it might be familiar to you, through works of literature and art that were really our chief source for talking about this episode. As well, I should add, I did have some time to spend in the Hoover this week, as well as all of those emigre narratives that cast a very particular lens on the problem of losing stuff, that cast one that was about the emigres themselves, right? And didn't capture the ways in which this process was working for all these other people. So you see here the publication history of Pasternak and Dr. Zhivago. There were, I should note, some chinks in this narrative, and this was just very fortuitous that I had written an undergraduate paper about this painting right here, which was painted by a man named Kuzma Petrovodkin, and I could go on about it for a very long time, and I'm happy to answer questions about it, but I'm not going to talk about it. But I will simply say that he painted it in 1937. It is in real life about twice the size of this screen. He meant it to be his absolute masterpiece. It was completely trashed in every art publication in the Soviet Union. He died the following year of natural causes, but definitely covered in shame. And this painting, you will perhaps be able to see here, depicts like the actual moment. It's a housewarming party for a family that has moved into a bourgeois apartment, presumably somewhere along the embankment. You can see the Admiralty over there in Petrograd. And you can see their stuff. They have a really bourgeois bird over there. You see this strange collection of things like the broken glass pane of the people and the portraits in gold frames, but then this woman sitting on this very rough stool and these clearly, injured soldiers and peasants, and then the woman at the hearth of power and the whole thing. This was quite a distance, although this painting did stay in the Tretyakov storage space until 1984, I think is the first time it was ever publicly displayed. It was a far distance from the real visuals of dispossession, which largely, at least from what I could find, do not exist. These are the only 3 photographs reflecting the process of dispossession that I ever came across. They fell out of a file I was reading, and to sort of emphasize how unusual they are, I can tell you just very briefly about their provenance, which is that the only reason we have pictures of someone walking into an apartment that has recently undergone a process of transfer, we might say, is because the man walking in was sent by the Department for Aerial Photography of a local military branch. And he was a photographer, and he was sent to the apartment where the former head of one of the Imperial Aerial Photography Societies had lived, and he was testing out the cameras to see if they worked. That's how we got pictures of this process. So all of these things made it hard to see, quite literally, this story. Dispossession also felt familiar to me as ideology, because I understood it to be the bedrock of the Soviet social welfare compact, which indeed it became, this redistribution of space and of things. It was hallowed in literature and Bolshevik film, and ideology have never fully materialized in real life. The improvised quality of Bolshevik policies is obviously very well known. It was nevertheless still a shock to me to learn that the Bolsheviks did not have a platform on the allocation of the built environment prior to seizing power. In fact, there was a party that did. It was the Left SRs, which was the party of the peasants, and they got to it in the summer of 1917 in the aftermath of the enormous housing crisis that the refugee movement and collapse of large parts of the empire had brought about in cities further in the interior, including Moscow. The party that spoke the most about space and its future was, in fact, not a party at all. It was a group of people called municipal socialists, who those of you who read the New York Times might identify as sewer socialists, because there was a headline yesterday about Mamdani. It's coming back. But it was a really important movement that, as Dan Rogers writes, was the outgrowth of a realization that laissez-faire was not going to solve the city's problems. But these people were not, they didn't identify as socialists. They identified as part of the conventional political firmament. And they talked a ton about what to do about apartments and space. But they were not on the scene after the Bolsheviks seized power. They did hold power for a very limited time in the summer of 1917 between the two regimes. So at any rate, how then do I end up in this space? And the answer, of course, is that it was a mistake. I didn't mean to. I was off in search of a different topic about the physical infrastructure of the state and its movement from Petrograd to Moscow. The archives were missing for a big part of that story. I tried to find it, the Moscow archives, I tried to find that story in other places, and I ended up reading the files of all these commissariats between, their founding in late 1917 and the middle of 1918, and they're only talking about one thing and one thing only, and that's apartments. That's apartments, that's sofas, that's people sleeping under tables, that's getting to Moscow and taking over this city and doing deals with grande dame princesses who they're signing contracts with to like inhabit their palaces and stuff. And they're making inventories for some people who have American citizenship who clearly want to use them for insurance claims. Oh, the Bolsheviks seized my stuff. Here's my insurance claim. I'm covered by a French company. Tell me exactly what you've taken and what you've done. And the Bolsheviks are like, sure, no problem. Write it all down. It was this crazy process of the seizure of the state being a seizure of actual physical space. And it got me interested in what it meant to really seize power in a revolution. And it sort of exposed what became the core problem of my book, the materiality of seizing power, which in the Soviet case is another way of describing the advent of state property. And so property is this category in Russian history that's really important. And as Katya Pravilova has observed for the Empire, Russian historians have a tendency to talk a lot about private property and what it does for society. Richard Pipes, famously. You see this in literature on the collapse as well, about what private property is expected to do for a society coming out of Soviet socialism. But there was far less attention on what it meant for the state to own things, for governance and ownership or possession to more or less coincide. And indeed, for the massive physical plant of this country to get folded into the revolutionary state, such as it was, in a matter of months. So by looking at the state purely trying to get space for itself, where I started, it became clear that we needed a way to think about the advent of state property, blurring the borders between ownership and governance, not just in factories and fields, but in apartments, in sofas, in clothing, and in all the things that the Bolsheviks would claim, some only for a short time, like clothing, but some for the duration, like apartments, to be the property of the state. So instead of seeing seizure as an endpoint, I started to see it as a beginning. And that meant, thinking through this change. And it required me to do a couple different things. First, I noticed start paying attention to the kinds of words that people were using to describe what was going on. As I mentioned, there's a new language of property, but it turned out that there were new languages to describe a lot of different things, like value, profit, money, all these terms that are familiar from economic life. But I tried to do this in a way sort of inspired by an anthropologist named Caroline Humphrey, who's observed that socialism actually continued to use the language of capitalism, by and large. And it had to do this because to do otherwise, to give the new phenomena it was creating new names, would be to acknowledge that it was diverging in some important ways from the expected path of transition from capitalism into this other thing. So this means digging into the lexicon of economic life around essential concepts, and that's the first problem, which I tackle in chapters on appraisal and documentation of things. I have some records here of some of the sorts of documentation that emerged that I'm happy to speak more about. This, for instance, is a protocol of seizure. This is when the process is already fairly well established. As you can see, there's a space in the blank for the inspector to draw out the floor plan of the apartment. There was a lot of conflict over what constituted living space, and a great many rules that emerged for sort of parsing and categorizing the built environment into different and categories of usage that pre-revolutionary Russian society had never had to think about before. A question I was often asked at first was like, well, why can't you just use tax records? Why aren't they just using tax records to do all this, to figure out what they have? And that's because tax records did things like figure out how many windows you had and assign a tax for it. They weren't concerned with the forms of usage that this new economy demanded. And so this new way of parsing and cutting up spaces emerges. The second and biggest problem, which I think I maybe have a couple minutes to talk about, I think was it 40 or 45 minutes? I have a few more minutes, okay, but I'll stop soon because I know it's was sources, was how to find sources. And I mentioned I had these cases and they were very important, but the thing about property is that it inheres in law, and the Bolsheviks attacked law And they attacked the types of records that in most other societies and settings would be used to trace a change in status and a change in property as a historical process, as well as in lived experience. And so this made revolutionary dispossession historically, from the perspective of finding the records to deal with it, kind of hard to see. This illegibility of dispossession, though, is not distinct to the Bolshevik case. It's a feature of dispossession which is in itself a phenomenon that has occurred very broadly across the 20th century in the seizure of Armenian and Greek property in the Ottoman Empire through to the Holocaust, both in Europe and beyond it, in the context of communist revolutions and population exchanges and other projects of social extermination. Dispossession went hand in hand with the cataclysmic violence of these events. Yet for much of the century, as one scholar of the Holocaust has written, it attracted comparatively little attention in either public discourse or scholarship because it was overshadowed by the loss of life. And I can talk a little bit more if you're curious about the politics of thinking about dispossession in these other cases outside of the Soviet one. But I think what matters is that in Europe, this inattention began to subside in the late 1980s and early 1990s in connection with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which triggered a broad process of reevaluating two major episodes of dispossession in the 20th century, that associated with the Holocaust and that associated with the onset of communist power in Eastern Europe. And the reckoning with that process was so big in these places, in Eastern Europe especially, that it even pushed out into France, into Denmark, into places that you find up until the late 1990s had not conducted state-level analyses of what was seized from whom. And these cases, in fact, are still in many places winding their way through European courts of restitution. So this process is sort of like set off by the Soviet collapse, but it's not one that happens in the former Soviet Union itself, in Russia. Paradoxically, as I discuss in the final chapters of my book, Russia doesn't go through this process of restitution, partly because of the way the Soviet Union's exit from communism happened, but also because it seemed like there were no sources, because so much of the paperwork had in fact been destroyed, the paperwork of possession. For instance, one of the things that I did not see even one time in the course of 2 years of archival research on this project was a title to a building, a piece of paper attesting to ownership of it being transferred within the Soviet state or passed around in some useful way. So the Soviet case lacks this sort of documentary basis, even more than in some of these other episodes. The Holocaust famously goes through kind of two typologies of dispossession. Controlled, as it were, and in Austria, I think I'm not going to necessarily use the precise language, but a wilder, more chaotic version. Both of those cases, however, are predicated on the further market valuation of the things changing hands, which requires particular forms of documentation, even if falsified. Even if, for instance, the Nazis are lowballing the value of a Jewish business that they're seizing. They're creating some records that can be used to trace that movement, whereas the Bolsheviks anticipated that businesses would not have value in the same terms that they had. So they're not generating a lot of the stuff. So instead, you turn to these complaints. I turn to these complaints. My book set about recovering an archive of dispossession, of revolutionary dispossession, to be found not in conventional legal documents sustaining the property order in pre-revolutionary Russia. Rather, this archive of dispossession grew up squarely in that legal order's absence, a voluminous paperwork documenting the wounds that this process inflicted on people and that they inflicted on one another in searing detail, like an autopsy of revolutionary events. This paperwork grew out of documents that began to appear simultaneously with revolutionary dispossession itself, and which bore witness to the coming of the revolution at home, in the places where people lived. And so these are the cases where I started, the cases like Tika Brazova's. I could conclude with a comment on sort of where to go, what happened to her and how she was treated in the end, but I will consider that with questions along with any other questions you might have, and I'm so grateful for your attention. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, the talk was great, and I'm a huge fan of the book. I have two questions, if I may. One of which is just being very tempted by the phrase musical chairs that you use repeatedly, and wondering if it was ever used, assuredly not, I assume, in any official document, but if you came across it being used, musica in studia or whatever, in contemporary sources from the period. And so I'm asking, bearing it with kind of Ilfin Petrov hovering at the back of my head, right? Thinking that there is, one of the most widely read novels from the 20s is a novel about dispossession or about the reaction to dispossession, and is all about a kind of game of musical chairs, where the chairs are circulating as much as the people who claim them. And then the other thing I'm wondering about is money. And I know that that's not the explicit focus, and there are other historians like Ilva for whom it is. But like money has always seemed like the most curious to me, or the most kind of interesting in some ways of the phenomena that remain after the revolution, because it feels so deeply tied to commodification. And so, yeah, is there any kind of vantage point that you feel comes from the study of dispossession in the immediate revolutionary aftermath as to sort of what money was in an early Soviet context, how it worked, like how it was or wasn't tied to things? I know that's very broad, but...
Do you want to take multiple, or should I answer one at a time? Okay, sure. So the musical chairs, alas, was my own invention. However, it came from two sources, from two particular places. The first was a phenomenon that I write about in the third chapter of the book that has to do with the realization that, and it was a source, it was a railway engineer who was writing to the authorities and complaining about the fact that he was now being moved for the third time in 5 months. His wife was very sick. These moves were very hard on their family. They had 2 small children. He was being moved into a 5-room apartment, although his family consisted of only 4 people. The norm in Moscow was allocated according to a measure of square. At that time, it was before the meters, but whatever. It was basically meters. Unlike, for instance, in Petrograd, where the norm was calculated in terms of rooms, number of rooms, which was easy because Petrograd was an actual ghost town at the time. But at any rate, he was being moved for the 3rd time into an apartment that was clearly too large for his family, and into which certainly some other family would also be settled. And he currently inhabited an apartment that was the correct size according to the norm for his family, and he was frustrated by this process. And he wrote this sort of like plea that traveled up to Vladimir Bonch-Burievich, who was Lenin's right-hand man. And so Bonch-Burievich made a large case out of this man's case, essentially, trying to present to the authorities that this doesn't make any sense. Why are we moving this man around from one place to the next, the next, the next, the next? Surely this isn't what socialism is, Bonch-Burievich writes. And it was paired with a set of rules that Moscow and Petrograd, and in fact many other cities, although there was no like national rule on this, but all these cities were generating this similar type of regulatory order that forbade people from moving movable things. So as people moved, the people, that is, you could see in this order, people weren't allowed to move furniture, they weren't allowed to move stuff anymore. So there were these crazy stories. This one woman tries to get a sofa out in the middle of the night, and her neighbors stone her, and like a woman like drops a frying pan on her head. She's trying to get this like sofa out, and there's a lot of worse. There's a lot. It's a lot, and it became clear that the people were the things that were understood as mobile. The movable things were like literally kind of being legally screwed to the ground because they couldn't keep track of them. It was the people who had to be in flux. And that's kind of where that came from. Money is a very big topic. It was one that I initially did have in the book and removed to keep the focus on materiality. Katja does tell that story pretty effectively, so I don't know that you really need my commentary on it. I definitely, have a lot of stories I can share, but I don't know that they would be analytically the punch that we need here.
I may ask, is there anything that surprised you in your research and in your conceptualization and conclusions? Because when we look, so it's two questions in one. When we look at all the socialist revolutions, whether later in the 1930s in the Soviet Union or other socialist countries outside of the Soviet Union, especially the Chinese, it's almost the same model. It all starts with chaos that is tolerated by the government, by the authorities, and then they channel it to their own interests, etc. So there is a pattern in the chaos there.
Yeah.
But so is there any surprise here that when you go after property that you will end up with this and that you stop in 1922, actually you could go all the way to 1991, etc. So is there a pattern here? Because for students of 1917, actually they will go to 1916 with the desertion, the mass desertions from the army when it starts, seizure of land, etc. And the Bolsheviks don't like it too much, but then they declare it socialism. So what's happening?
I think that's right. They might not like it too much, but they declare it socialism. That's one. But I think the thing that surprised me, or analytically, was that there were certain, that's why I use the phrase isomorphism for like similar things happening in similar conditions. Ideology is a condition. It's a conditioning factor. So it's not actually an explanation that eviscerates or eradicates the significance of ideology, but it is to say that there was a great deal of open-endedness about what was happening. The seizure of property sets a fire under people's rears. It's terrifying, quite literally, and it sets off this process of accumulation that eclipses state control immediately, I think. I was surprised by this because it felt almost mechanical at times, if that makes sense. Like you say, a pattern that is integrated into an ideological concept, but is, as I note, very much improvised. The improvisation, I think, also wasn't unexpected because that is, one of the constitutive features. What I got really interested in throughout, though, was in trying to figure out how the improvised outcomes were then sort of sewn in and the seams ironed out to make them a part of this pattern. I would also add that the notion of what happened as being a pattern emerges so quickly. That really surprised me. And there was a problem because the Bolsheviks had been in two places. They had been in Petrograd and Moscow within that first year of rule. And those two cities had completely different landscapes of built, of their built environment and their needs by virtue of the fact that one of them, as I noted, was actually the edifice of state. It was purpose-built to house that state. There was no space crunch in Petrograd because everyone who lived there who wasn't, employed at that moment tried to leave in that moment because there was no food. So it was kind of like a ghost town. And so when they're creating their sets of, well, how should we do things? How do we organize buildings and the control of the built environment in a socialist way? You see there's such an incredible proliferation of imagination around how you could do this. Places you wouldn't expect would do it, did it, like Tsarskaya Sela, which is where all the palaces are. Tsarskaya Sela creates a housing authority and starts to redistribute space. And they rank their buildings, but they do it in this very different sort of like almost sweet sort of way where they're like, well, the finishes on this palace are really so nice. Like there's a lot of gilding, the windows are extra tall, so this is a really nice one, and like the workers should definitely get this really pretty room that we've got. In Petrograd, they're like, people can have every individual, every person over the age of 10. There's a lot of interesting stuff around like when people reach adulthood and what happens in the city in that moment, and problems about siblings of different genders and how to accommodate family life in these new rules. But in Petrograd, these are all very easy to resolve because there's just an abundance of places for people to go. And in Moscow, that's not the case, and the norms take a very different shape. And then the final thing I would say is that there's been so much upheaval already in the first 3 years. In fact, there's a study that Yuri Ladin, who's a Bolshevik, that he performs in 1920, in which he concludes that the Bolsheviks have dispossessed the existing bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie as it existed on the eve of the revolution, probably already 2 times over by 1920, in his estimation. And yet the process doesn't stop. And the reason for that, in part, is that all of these local Soviets, as they write when the authorities try to stop it, they continually need new, baskets of bourgeois buildings in order to do their basic work of the revolution. We have to keep making the revolution, so we need more bourgeois housing. So buildings identified as bourgeois become particular sites for the musical chairs. Those people often end up suffering kind of the most because they're moving around so much. The notion of a bourgeois building itself emerges as a kind of asset that the authorities want to retain possession of and find a way to use.
My question is about where you found these documents. Were they in Hoover or archives in the US, or did you go to Moscow and St. Petersburg and look in various libraries and archives there, or all of the above? But I mean, it's certainly a lot of work and difficult just finding these things once you've decided, but could you say a bit about it?
No, it's my pleasure to write about, to speak about that for a moment, because my work was made a little bit easier by the Bolsheviks because, as I said, they were super interested in what we would call problem shooting, the revolution, or troubleshooting, not problem shooting, the revolution. And they create, so, everyone is in the new regime trying to find a way to make themselves useful, and this is the biggest problem for the people associated in some way, shape, or form with economic life in the market, and lawyers too. So like NARCOMFIN, the People's Commissar of Finances, and also this body that was known as the Institute for Government Control. It's the General Budget Office, the GAO, the General Accounting Office of the US government, as was. And it is in charge of making sure that people aren't pumping up contracts and stuff like that. And the revolution happens and they don't have anything to do because there are no budgets. And so they try and drum up different kinds of work they can do for themselves, and they start to be like, okay, well, we're gonna be the ones who make sure that other kinds of orders that the government issues are being implemented and followed. And so they start, going around trying to drum up business for themselves, and they identify a lot of problems around property and its allocation. And at the same time, this guy who I mentioned, Vladimir Ivanich, who was one of the head figures in the early Soviet administration, is getting all of these complaints. And so he says, why don't you guys form a bureau of complaint? So they create a bureau of complaint about the revolution, and they gather up all of these cases. And once I had those, it was a lot easier to go back through the municipal records and try and figure out what was happening in the neighborhoods. The neighborhood records that I show up here were far and away the most, I don't know how to get rid of that, but they were far and away the most interesting because they were very, very close to the ground around the actual process of dispossession itself. This is a sidebar, but the reason I mentioned I wasn't able to do that original project I'd been interested in was because purportedly the records of the Moscow city government are in the wind. They're not, no one knows where they are. And so we actually don't have an archival history of the revolution in Moscow with records from the Moscow Soviet. And so I worked to piece together portions of that history using records from the central government and then from these neighborhood records as they were. But the neighborhoods were they were harder to work in. So yes, this was all in Russia, to answer your question.
I'm curious about kind of the relationship between new lexicons being created, specifically with the concept of maintenance or repair, like very that kind of thing. If this cabinet isn't mine, how does someone, things break, beds break, sofas break, can I take it down to a shop? Who comes, how do we manage this at the state level in this scenario? And then is that a sort of entry point for inserting new lexicon, ideology, getting people, I don't know. You're having this discussion right now. How is the state responding in this moment to someone getting a pot or pan dropped on their head because of a sofa? Like,
The pot or pan, that just happened. That wasn't an issue.
But you know what I mean? How are they actually inserting the proper discourse?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about movable possessions, and one of the big problems that all of this posed for revolutionary authorities, is that they've somewhat accidentally backed into controlling a major asset that isn't a productive asset. It's not a factory, it's something that it's a consumer, it's an end user thing, and they struggle a lot with that. And with the idea that the particular objects that they're disposing will be enjoyed by individuals and not by collectives, and how to organize allocation in a way that overcomes this basic feature of like the built environment and how people live. There is an enormous amount of spoliation in this period. Victor Shklovsky, who has this beautiful narrative called A Sentimental Journey, writes about encountering some of his, he had been a driving instructor at the tail end of the First World War and in the Provisional Government Army, and he encounters some of his students, his driving students, in Petrograd one night, and they go back to where these young men are staying, and he finds that they're on the 3rd floor so far, by which he means that there's a building that they're squatting in, and there's no fuel, very little food, heating materials, so they're basically burning through apartments, kind of one by one. And when they burn up the 1st floor, Shklovsky writes, they go up to the 2nd floor, they dig a hole, they break a hole in the floor, they burn the floor material, they use that for a toilet, there's also no plumbing. And then they burn that apartment, its contents. And then they go up to the 3rd floor. So he's like, they're on the 3rd floor so far. People feared doing damage to things because it could lead to arrest, because they didn't have a clear understanding. So Shklovsky's guys are off the books, to say the least. People who were on the books, though, they feared their responsibility for objects that come into their environment of all sorts, whether they are particular pieces of furniture or whether they are, for instance, there's like a building commandant who's really upset about a stockpile of cafe furniture in the basement of his building that he's been defending, that he's been protecting for the last year, but the thieves have gotten too plentiful and he can't keep people away any longer, and so he writes to officially remove legal responsibility from himself. So there are like huge numbers of documents of people doing something that you had never seen before 1917 outside of Russia, people declaring that they are not owners of things. I mean, you have to do it, you have to renounce rights to things, obviously, in different legal settings. But this is like a big mass phenomenon of people being like, I do not own this, this is not mine, I don't have it, and I cannot be held legally accountable for it, because they are indeed quite terrified that they will be arrested for ruining stuff. There's a lot of, one of the reasons the state doesn't continue to hang on to movable goods as something that it's going to try and control has to do with some of these problems. And so they shed that in the early 1920s, that responsibility.
Last question.
A couple of questions related to Chernobyl story. So that storage, it's when she gave her properties to that storage, when she put it
Ticho Brazowa.
Ticho Brazowa.
Yeah.
So it was private probably at that time. But when she came to get it, it became belong to state. That
Yes.
facility. That
Yes, it had already, as she was informed, been transferred to the control of the state 3 times over, but because of this new decree of April 1920, the state had relinquished its rights to her things as well by the time she got back. So the whole problem Ticho Brazowa posed was, what do you do with someone who missed the revolution? Like, this all happened, all the stuff was seized, everyone was redistributed, and now we're done. And here she comes floating in and all her stuff is still there. Are we real? And so what the legal reasoning, there was a huge legal case that emerges out of her story. And what the Commissariat of Justice eventually decrees is that it cannot allow someone to escape the revolution. And so even though the revolution is legally over, it will be enacted on her now.
And second, it's kind of a little bit sidetrack. So her son was in high tech, I would assume at that time, railroad high tech. So he was New Graz, and this is how he got his job.
He was what now?
He just graduated, and that's why he got. The
Yeah,
job.
I think he. I'm not sure exactly how old he was, and I'm not certain he was high tech because I think he might have been a dentist. He was like an engineer, but he also had some dental training.
I see. But railroads, and you mentioned railroads several times
Yeah.
during your story answering questions. So railroads, they were belonged to government. I mean, they were belonged to state probably before revolution. I think they were named after His Highness.
They were
Nicholas
concessions,
II,
yeah. Mhm.
So railroads were working, despite not in best shape, but they were working. So she was able to. Her son got job. She was able to move to one place, move back. What I want to say that when properties belong to state, regardless of revolution, even that complicated property, I think it is, railroad is like 10% of government property. It is a huge industry. It was working despite all this mess which
For
was
the
happening.
week she left, that stopped. That's why she didn't return for 3 years.
No, I understand, but railroads itself, industry, was working despite all these events which were happening.
Yes and no. No. I mean, they were, like, if you read I would love to chat more about railroads, because it is indeed very interesting and fun. And there's a weird, like,
And
debate
probably
about
it's
whether
better
they were
documented than this stuff. I mean,
The railroads?
what properties were, transition of properties in business.
Yes, it was something that folded fairly precisely into a nominal state organ, but that sort of framing of it doesn't account for the fact that the country was shortly after she left chopped up into lots of different places that didn't recognize that authority, and so the whites controlled a lot of the railroads, and then also the greens controlled railroads, and then also just like a bunch of random soldiers controlled railroads all over. Like they hijacked Lenin's train when he was getting to Moscow. There were like guys with rifles. Bolshevik writes about this. He exaggerates it a lot, but like it definitely did happen. Thank you all so much.